Before Joan Baez became a symbol, before she became a banner carried by crowds and causes, she was simply a voice, quiet, searching, and already shaped by contradiction. She was born into a world that promised moral clarity, yet offered very little mercy. A Quaker household taught her discipline, conscience, restraint. But outside that shelter, she learned something far more lasting, what it feels like to be different, to be watched, to be marked. As a child, she carried her father's darker complexion into classrooms that did not know how to welcome it. The cruelty was casual, almost thoughtless, but its echo stayed. Long before she understood politics, she understood injustice. Long before she stood on stages, she learned what it meant to stand alone. Music came quietly, almost by accident. A small instrument, a few borrowed chords, nothing that looked like destiny. And yet, even then, there was a sense that sound could say what words could not, that a song could hold both sorrow and resistance at the same time. She did not grow up dreaming of fame. She grew up learning to listen, to silence, to pain, to the unease beneath ordinary life. And in that listening, something began to form. Not a career, not a plan, but a voice that would one day carry far more than melodies. It would carry a conscience. Joan Baez did not learn defiance from books. She learned it from experience, from the small, daily moments when obedience felt like a quiet kind of betrayal. Even as a teenager, she showed an instinctive resistance to rules that asked for compliance without conscience. When she refused to take part in a school air raid drill, it wasn't a dramatic gesture. It was simply a line she would not cross. But it revealed something essential. Once she believed something was wrong, she could not pretend otherwise. At home, music itself became another quiet rebellion. An ukulele, a handful of chords, and a growing love for songs that her parents did not trust. They feared the world that came with them. She heard a world that needed to be answered. While others her age were learning to fit in, she was learning to stand apart. Everything shifted the day she was taken to a folk concert. There, for the first time, she saw music not as entertainment, but as testimony. These were not songs meant to decorate silence. They were meant to challenge it. She began to practice in private, then in front of small, forgiving audiences. Still shy, still uncertain, still unaware that she was preparing for a life lived almost entirely in public. At that stage, nothing about her life suggested history. She was not chasing a stage, she was following a feeling. That truth, once heard, had to be carried forward, even if your hands were shaking when you did it. When Joan Baez arrived in Boston at the end of the 1950s, she stepped into a city that was quietly changing its own reflection. The coffee houses around Harvard Square were not grand stages. They were small rooms filled with smoke, arguments, and songs that had traveled a long way to be heard. Students, poets, and restless minds gathered there not to escape the world, but to question it. By day, she attended classes. By night, she listened. And slowly she understood that the two parts of her life were moving in different directions. In those cramped rooms, folk music was not a style, it was a language. Old ballads and protest songs shared the same fragile air, and each one seemed to be asking what kind of future could still be built. Her first paid performances were almost invisible in scale. A handful of people, a few dollars, more nerves than confidence. She even wondered if she should hide behind another name, as if the right name might make the fear smaller. In the end, she kept her own. It was the first of many times she would choose honesty over comfort. Her voice did the rest. Clear, unusually pure, and impossible to mistake for anyone else's. People remembered it. They came back. And without any dramatic announcement, the rooms began to fill. It did not feel like success. It felt like being slowly discovered by a future that had been waiting. The invitation that changed everything did not arrive with ceremony. It came as most turning points do, quietly, almost modestly. One festival appearance, one shared stage, one moment where her voice carried farther than it ever had before. Suddenly, the rooms were no longer small, and the silence before she sang no longer belonged to a few people. It belonged to thousands. She was still barely out of her teens when the wider world began to notice her. Critics searched for metaphors, and audiences searched for words. but they heard felt older than fashion and newer than anything on the radio. Record companies followed, each offering a different version of the same promise. She chose the one that left her alone. Her first album was recorded quickly, without ornament, without ambition for spectacle, just a voice and a guitar, standing in an empty space and letting it echo. No one expected much from it, least of all her, and yet people listened. Not casually, they listened as if they had been waiting for something they couldn't name. The record did not conquer the charts, it settled into them, stayed, traveled quietly from hand to hand, dorm room to dorm room. With it, Joan Baez stopped being a secret. She became a presence, not loud, not forceful, but unmistakable. And once she was there, it was impossible to pretend she hadn't always been needed. Fame did not arrive alone. It brought with it a meeting that would quietly reshape more than one life. When Joan Baez encountered a young songwriter whose voice seemed almost deliberately unpolished, few could have predicted how deeply their paths would intertwine. He had words that cut and questioned. She had a voice that could carry them into rooms that would otherwise remain closed. She was already known. He was still becoming. And yet, she recognized something in him that went beyond talent, a restlessness, a sense that songs could do more than comfort. When she began inviting him onto her stage, she was not making a strategic move. She was sharing a platform. In doing so, she changed the direction of both their stories. Their performances together felt like a conversation between two different kinds of truth. Her clarity and his rough edges did not compete. They revealed each other. For a brief, luminous time, they seemed to stand at the center of something larger than either of them, a moment when music and conscience were learning to speak the same language. But such balances are fragile. As the decade moved forward, the distance between their visions grew harder to ignore. What had once felt like harmony began to sound like divergence, and slowly, almost reluctantly, the partnership that had defined an era began to loosen, leaving behind both gratitude and a quiet sense of loss. The break was not only personal, it was philosophical. As the world outside grew louder and more divided, Joan Baez felt less interested in where music could take her and more certain about where she had to stand. Concerts began to feel less like performances and more like gatherings of witness. The applause mattered less than the message. She refused the comfortable compromises that success offered. When war demanded silence or obedience, she offered neither. She spoke openly, acted openly, and accepted the consequences with a calm that unsettled even her supporters. Jail was not a tragedy to her. It was simply another place where conscience had to be defended. During these years, her life and her beliefs became inseparable. Marriage, protest, and music folded into a single, complicated identity. She sang for crowds, but also for individuals, for those imprisoned, for those sent to fight, for those who had no voice left to raise. Even her records began to change. They grew more direct, sometimes more severe, less concerned with beauty and more with truth. There was a cost to this path. Fame does not reward refusal for long. But she had already decided that being heard mattered more than being embraced. In a time when many were choosing sides, she chose something harder, to become a constant reminder that comfort and justice rarely live in the same place. By the time the noise of the great movements began to fade, Joan Baez was no longer standing at the center of the cultural storm. In some ways, she had outgrown it. In others, it had simply moved on. The world was changing its music, its heroes, its language, and she, who had never chased trends, did not begin to chase them now. Her work turned inward without abandoning its principles. She began to write more, to look back as much as forward. Some albums felt like letters never sent. Others felt like conversations with a past that refused to stay silent. One song in particular, written years after the emotions that inspired it, finally gave shape to a chapter she had never fully closed. It was not an accusation, it was not a confession, it was something rarer, an honest memory set to melody. Commercial success came and went. Sometimes it barely came at all. But she kept recording, kept performing, kept lending her name and her presence to causes that did not promise applause. Human rights, distant countries, forgotten prisoners, her voice kept traveling, even when the spotlight did not follow. Gradually, something else happened. Without announcement, without ceremony, she stopped being seen as a figure of her time and started being seen as something else entirely, a constant, a witness, someone who had stayed when so many others had passed through. In the final years of her long public journey, Joan Baez no longer needed to prove anything. The voice that had once cut through crowded halls now carried a different weight, softer perhaps, but deeper, seasoned by decades of standing in difficult places and saying difficult things. She continued to sing, not because the world demanded it, but because it was the only language she had ever truly trusted. Farewell tours came not as spectacle, but as quiet acknowledgments. Each concert felt less like a performance and more like a shared memory, a gathering of people who understood they were not only saying goodbye to an artist, but to a way of believing in what art could do. When she finally stepped away, nothing ended. Her songs remained. More than that, the example remained. A life that had never separated beauty from responsibility, a career that had never confused applause with purpose. Joan Baez was never just a singer. She was a reminder that a voice can be a shelter, a weapon, and a promise at the same time. And long after the stages fall silent, that promise continues to move, quietly, stubbornly, from one generation to the next.